One day, I was wandering the pathways of Thirsk Cemetery, and amongst the crooked old stones, I saw a small, solitary gravestone under a tree, erected by the children of Thirsk to the memory of dear little Lottie Hamilton of Alexandria, Scotland, who lost her life in the railway collision at Manor House Sidings, November the 2nd, 1892, aged 5 years. I was instantly moved by this tiny grave. I wondered who she was, and what had happened to her. After all, each crumbling memorial in the cemetery was like a lost story, a life now completely forgotten, save in fading text and chiselled stone. I knew at once that I must research Lottie Hamilton, bring her story to life in any small way that I could. What followed, after hours of searching through old parish archives, was a sad and tragic story that is almost entirely forgotten by today's rail passengers. But now, for the first time, I am able to bring the memory of this little girl back to life, and make known for evermore the railway tragedy that unfolded in Thirsk. This is the sad tale of Lottie Hamilton. The railway disaster itself concerned a signalman by the name of James Holmes, of whom it is believed had worked in this position since first joining the railway in 1881. He worked in the Manor House Sidings signal box 3 miles from Thirsk on the York to Darlington main line. This image, from the Illustrated London News, was drawn in 1892 following the disaster, and shows the signal box as it appeared at the time. There, Holmes, of whom lived in nearby Thornton-le-Moor, would work 12-hour shifts, operating the points and signals to control the movement of the passing trains. In what could be almost a grim foreshadowing of the coming disaster, Holmes experienced his own personal tragedy on the day before the events took place. His daughter, Rose, had been taken ill, and after travelling the 4 miles by train to Northallerton in search of a doctor, he walked back home, having left a note in the office, the doctor absent, with no word on when he would return. Upon arriving home, however, Holmes found that his daughter had died during his absence. The time was 2 p.m. Distraught, he walked a mile to Ottrington Station, informing the station master, Thomas Kirby, that he would not be fit for work that evening, and a telegraph was promptly sent for a relief signalman to be sent for. However, upon returning at 6 p.m. to check on the situation, he was informed that no such relief worker was available, and a traumatised Holmes, of whom had now been awake for over 36 hours, had no choice but to begin his shift on the signals. A few hours later, we are able to piece together the first details about Lottie Hamilton, of whom we know from her gravestone lived in Alexandria, Scotland. She had likely travelled by train, either from her hometown or from Glasgow to Edinburgh, where the Up Scotch Express was due to leave at 10:30 p.m. on the night of the disaster. However, due to the late arrival of several carriages, the train was instead split, and the first half left on time at 10:30 p.m, arriving safely in London, and the second, of which Lottie and her aunt, Anne Glenn McCulloch, will have boarded, left at the later time of 11:02 p.m. The purpose of their journey has been difficult to ascertain, with only one scant source from the Darlington and Stockton Times suggesting that they were travelling to Australia. so possibly embarking on the long and dangerous trip with the hope of a better, new life to come, overseas in the colonies. If this is the case, then thoughts of this new life most likely occupied Lottie's mind as she travelled with her doll through town and country, the train arriving at 3:39 a.m. at Darlington. Unknown to the driver, a goods train, bound from Middlesbrough to Harrogate, had been allowed onto the main line in front of it. It had left Northallerton at 3:38 a.m. and arrived near to Holmes' signal box at 3:45 a.m. Noticing the signals were set to danger and thus unable to proceed, this goods train came to a halt outside of the signal box at 3:50 a.m. Holmes, as he later said, had by then become overmastered by sleep, and when he awoke at 4 a.m. to an attention message in his cabin, meaning that Lottie's train was fast approaching, he believed that he had merely forgotten to clear his signals after the earlier first half of the express had passed by, and so he set all of his signals to go. He had forgotten about the goods train. It is noted that he had had second thoughts about this confusing moment just after waking up, but upon telegraphing the nearby Ottrington signal box, it was too late for anything to be done about the approaching express. When Holmes set his signals to go, he had given the green light for the train to crash into the back of the stationary goods train at speeds of over 60 miles an hour. These real photographs from the time of the disaster show only some of the horrors that unfolded on that evening. At the time of the collision, 9 passengers and the guard from the goods train were killed, and 39 passengers and 4 train crew were seriously injured. However, around an hour later, boiling coals from the firebox of the engine on the express train burst into flames, and the fire, accelerated by the use of pinch oil gas lighting system, meant that people were roasted to death, as one tabloid newspaper put it. And the Illustrated London News showed an image of the train becoming engulfed by flame, much to the horror of the spectators. It must have been a truly terrifying spectacle, and it is said that some bodies were incinerated entirely, leaving only calcified bones, and others were found with metal and coins fused to them from the intensity of the heat. Whichever bodies or survivors could be rescued from the wreckage were frantically moved to nearby Thirsk station to remove them from the worsening fires of the wreck. Amongst this inferno of death and metal, lost somewhere within the smoke and the heat, was Lottie Hamilton. In the archives of the Thirsk Railway Disaster, many focused purely on the technical details and gave passing, impersonal mentions to the great loss of life. I wanted to know more about Lottie in particular, a task of which might have seemed almost impossible. A few articles mentioned her name, but at first that was all I could find. However, after much searching, I was able to discover an article of which actually told some more of her story, a tale of which it described as the most distressing part of the Thirsk Railway disaster. The article reads, "For a long time her screams were heard, before she could be extricated, and not only was it evident that she was badly bruised, but she was suffering frightful agony from contact with the flames." If this does not sound distressing enough, we know that from reports of the wreckage that it stood for over an hour before the fire started, meaning that Lottie was trapped inside for this length of time, only to be overtaken by the intense heat of the fire. The article continues, "She was tenderly carried to Thirsk, but on the way she expired. A pathetic souvenir of the poor girl's fate was afterwards taken from the wreck. This was her doll, with which she had been playing. Its head was melted off, and the dress and body, like that of the unfortunate little mistress, were burned. The dead were taken to Thirsk station and laid out in the waiting room on the upper platform. When I was researching, I was also able to find a small newspaper article, this time noting that Lottie would be buried in Thirsk, with a gravestone erected for her, that same gravestone that I found. Here we also learned that the driver of the train miraculously survived. "They say I'm brave," he said, "but I only did what anybody else would have done. I could not bear to see the poor women screaming and the wee bairns crying. I've got 8 bairns at home myself." It is said that the bodies, once brought to Thirsk Cemetery, were identified and released back to their families. But Lottie and her aunt were buried in Thirsk, many hundreds of miles from their hometown in Dunbartonshire, Scotland. Were they truly emigrating to Australia then? Perhaps with no family or home left behind in Scotland, and so were buried in the town where they died, making Lottie's gravestone one of the only remaining memories in Thirsk of the disaster, as if her lonely white gravestone was somehow calling out to be remembered. It is certainly possible, as, despite a great deal of searching the registers of births, I was unable to find anything on Lottie or her aunt prior to the disaster, with only their deaths being recorded in the parish registers, linking them forever with Thirsk and the Manor House Siding's disaster. In this article describing the disaster as one of the saddest stories in railway history, we learn that James Holmes, the signalman, despite being initially charged with manslaughter, was dismissed without punishment, much to the cheers of the court, the jury taking sympathy on his personal tragedy. Nothing remains now at Thirsk station to remind passengers of this dreadful event, of which could have been prevented had track circuits been installed, thus preventing the signals from being cleared by Holmes. At the time, however, this technology was new, and although the Manor House Sidings was part of a major route, now forming part of the East Coast Main Line, the need for advanced safety there was said to be low, as the block was one of the shortest and straightest to be found anywhere in the country. Most travelling today from Thirsk, of course, would have no idea that such an event took place there, that the bodies of the dead, including that of Lottie Hamilton, were laid out on the platforms and waiting rooms of where they now stand to await their train. If one searches hard enough, however, remnants of the disaster can still be found. This memorial to the North East Railway accident at Thirsk is now part of the Science Museum collection, as is this rather strange shoehorn, of which was actually made from rescued brass taken from the train wreckage itself. Even more recently, relics of the event have been uncovered, such as this railwayana auction held near Thirsk, in which a chipped cup from the disaster was offered for sale as part of the auction. In 1992, a Thirsk Town Council meeting was heard, where it was stated that soon would be 100 years since Lottie Hamilton died, and it was asked if the council would like to mark this in some way, of which they agreed. However, I have been unable to find out what kind of event was enacted in her honour. One thing is certain: this little grave is profoundly moving, and it shows the depths of memory that can be found when we pause and wonder who is buried there beneath the stone. Who was the person behind the name? Lottie Hamilton lived for only 5 years, but her memory will forever remind us of the events that unfolded in November 1892. I was not looking for her when I visited the cemetery, and I found her grave only by the chance of it catching my eye on a summer's day, as if she wants her small voice to be heard once more. So remember her when the train pulls away from Thirsk station, as the whistle sings its sad song in the steam-heavy air, and yet another journey reaches its end.